Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to Environment California Research and Policy Center's webinar to launch our new story map, Reconnecting California's Wildlife. I am Sam Terzona, Environment California Research and Policy Center's Wildlife Campaign Associate. I'm super excited to launch this all with you. So, quickly, I wanted to go over our agenda. So, we'll do an overview of our new story map. We'll go over what it is, background of how it was created, and some few key takeaways from the story map. Then we'll walk through quickly how to navigate the resource, and then we'll hear from our fantastic panelists who are working on specific projects covered in the story map, one on endangered peninsular bighorn sheep and one on a community group working to save California newts. So the main question that kind of inspired the curiosity that led to this story map is, why does California's wildlife need reconnection? California is the most biologically diverse state in the nation, but wildlife is struggling to survive. Between 1970 to 2020, monitored wildlife populations have declined by 39%, and California is home to the most threatened animals of any state. We have over 300 threatened and endangered species, ranging from the smallest critters like salamanders, pictured at the top right, to our large carnivores like mountain lions. And one of the main reasons that wildlife is struggling is simply due to habitat loss, which is generally the reduction of suitable habitat for animals to live. So in the top left, we have an example of habitat destruction, a type of habitat loss, which for this example is just clear cutting a forest. Then in the top right, we have habitat degradation, one example of which is invasive species coming in and kind of taking over a habitat, in this case, invasive mustard. But the main mechanism we explore in reconnecting California's wildlife is habitat fragmentation, which is the cutting up of usable habitat into smaller pieces, which prevents wildlife from accessing the resources they need to survive. In California, wildlife face threats from our growing, sprawling cities, our roads, and other transportation that crisscross through our mountains, coastal wetlands, and majestic deserts. And the results of that habitat fragmentation are pretty severe. Animals in California are programmed to move, just like we move to get food, water, or find partners. They have systems in place that have lasted for centuries. We have migratory species that move over large distances in search of food, and small species that make quick dashes to nearby water bodies, and species that just require a large amount of territory in order to survive. And they're having to make those tough decisions to cross our roads and transit to access these resources, leading to things like wildlife vehicle collisions and other conflicts. And these are some images that I collected while traveling for this work. One is a deer carcass near Highway 395, and another is a newt, which was hit pretty much right in front of me as I was along a road where newts were trying to cross. Um, but luckily, there are solutions, such as wildlife corridors and wildlife crossings. So, wildlife corridors are coordinated conservation efforts to protect and restore key pathways of conserved land to connect habitats. They help ensure that wildlife can move, and they look and act in a variety of different ways. One example here pictured on the left is a kind of stream corridor that is protected in the East Bay, actually. And then wildlife crossings are a type of corridor, like underpasses or overpasses, that allow animals to safely cross roads and allow drivers to safely get home. When built with the right fencing, wildlife crossings can reduce these collisions by over 90%. And the image on the right is of Highway 17's Laurel Curve wildlife crossing. And we already have great projects underway all over California to ensure that our wildlife can move, mate, and migrate. And so here are just some general numbers. So Caltrans, or California's Department of Transportation, has identified 144 priority fish and wildlife connectivity projects throughout California. California's Department of Fish and Wildlife have created a map of priority barriers to wildlife movement that they're hoping to remediate and help animals pass those barriers. And the California Natural Resources Agency is leading efforts to conserve 30% of terrestrial lands and 30% of coastal waters by 2030. And these numbers were something that I knew pretty quickly into my work as our wildlife campaign associate, but they sound really promising in theory. But I had this really urgent curiosity to really dive into what they mean. All of these stats are pretty general for California, and I know that there's thousands of stories of animals struggling to live, and they're really localized stories throughout the state. And I also know that there's hundreds of projects with so many people working to save wildlife in their local areas. And so the core questions I hope to answer in my work and with this story map is, how are animals really moving in our state in these local areas? How are these local projects actually reconnecting animals across our state? And who is the people actually working on these projects? And so to make this resource, I set out to answer those questions. And it resulted in our resource, Reconnecting California's Wildlife, which is kind of a compilation of storytelling, research, video collecting, and on-the-site interviews that can act as a hub for people to learn more about why animals are moving, what projects are near them, and why people care about them. So we came up with this story map idea to showcase all that work. In total, we are launching this project with 14 case studies covering mountain lions, mule deer, elk, desert bighorn sheep, and salamanders. Three of these case studies will launch with videos that I made from site visits that I conducted this year as I traveled from Petaluma to Susanville to the Mojave Desert and to our southern border and to LA and back, where I live in Oakland for this project. And so now I kind of want to quickly walk you through um, what the story map really looks like and how to use it. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Okay, great. So here is the landing page, and we just dropped the link to this in the chat as well. So on this landing page, you can find our interactive story map that goes to all 14 of these case studies here. You'll also find an overview of all of the species that we're covering, our key findings and policy recommendations as well on this main page. But the real bread and butter of this work is this map, which you can see here, which has these 14 case studies. And so I'll click on one. So the best way to use this is to actually click on the pin and then click on this button here that says click to read the in-depth case study. You'll click on that and it'll open a new article that has a detailed overview of the project and species in the area that we're covering. So this is an example of the elusive East Bay mountain lions, which really dives into the Alameda County Resource Conservation District's wildlife crossing work in the East Bay. And so as you scroll through, you'll see videos that we created, photos that we took and gathered from partners all across the state. And then in many of these, you'll find smaller story maps. So here's an example of one. And these little smaller story maps can do a few different things. So on this one, this is a project covering wildlife crossings with the goal of building around 2 to 3 crossings in the East Bay. So this map goes over the priority locations for those wildlife crossings. Other maps might actually walk you through the migration patterns for a species. And I'm just clicking through to show you all the more information that you can find on one of these story maps. And then if you want to learn more, at the bottom of each page, you can find the big story map again and keep searching. It's also color-coded for each species to try to make it easier to find. And so that is our story map. Um, and so now we're going to just quickly go through just a brief overview of all of the different things we're covering in here, just to help orient yourself and also just learn a little bit more about each species and why we decided to cover certain species over others. There are hundreds of species in California that we could have picked, but we picked ones that were pretty far and wide across California that generally have pretty discernible movement patterns. And a lot of wildlife crossing projects are actually being built and geared towards a lot of these animals to help ground ourselves in this work. And so I want to start with mountain lions. So mountain lions can be found in more than 40% of our state. They are found from our Northern California's coastal forests to low-lying shrubs and woodlands of Southern California to our deserts a little bit and throughout the Sierra Nevada. And this February, all mountain lions that live from kind of the South Bay area along the coast into San Diego, and a little bit out into the desert were added as threatened to California's Endangered Species Act. And we go a lot more in detail about why exactly this is through our case studies, but one of the main reasons are our roads. Mountain lions are hit when they're trying to find new territory or simply moving around in their pretty extensive territories. Often they'll be caught with GPS collars, going close to highways and then turning around for fear. And so along our coasts, they're now found in small, fragmented populations throughout the entire coast with low genetic diversity and just trouble meeting other mountain lions outside of their small regions. And so we cover projects in the Santa Cruz Mountains, the East Bay, the Tehachapi Mountains in Kern County, and the Santa Monica Mountains. And the next animal we covered were mule deer. And so you might be asking yourself, and I kind of had a similar question when I started this work of why cover deer? They're pretty abundant, seemingly. And in some cases, yes, they are pretty abundant. But there are specific cases across our state where deer are really being threatened right now, and their historical migratory routes are being threatened by our roads. And this is particularly in the case in the Sierra Nevada, where these natural migration patterns from their summer to winter habitats is in a pretty tight balance. And so protecting deer seasonal migrations is imperative to ensure that mule deer populations can continue to thrive in our state for generations to come. And so for this project, I visited one site of an in-plan wildlife crossing site in Lassen County. And then we also discuss another project in Mammoth Lakes, which both center around one road, which is Highway 395, which cuts through the Sierra Nevadas. So another ungulate, you could say, are these like hoofed mammals, are elk, which are pretty incredible. Honestly, before working on this project, I didn't fully understand where elk were or what they were up to in our state. And I learned that there are three subspecies of elk, Thule, Roosevelt, and Rocky Mountain, that were all nearly hunted to extinction in the 1800s, but have made a great comeback due to careful conservation. But as these elk look to disperse back to their historical ranges, which they really do like to wander, you can see a picture of one wandering across a road, they are running into cars. And you really do not want to hit an elk on our roads. And so we cover three projects trying to reduce these chances of vehicle collisions, a wildlife crossing in Siskiyou County and on Pacheco Pass, which is a road that goes from Gilroy to the Central Valley, kind of in the Central Coast region. And then we also cover an experimental signage project in Humboldt County as well. The next one that I'm really excited about is the desert bighorn sheep. This is kind of our last big mammal that we cover. Desert bighorn are one of two subspecies of bighorn sheep here in California and are known for their elusiveness out in the desert, giving them the nickname the ghosts of the desert. They seasonally travel between forage and lambing habitat. Typically, females ewes will travel with their lambs in social groups, while males or rams will travel long distances between these groups. And new and old infrastructure are threatening bighorn throughout the desert, which rely on large interconnected landscapes to have healthy populations. And we were able to visit both the Mojave Desert and the South Border for this project. And I'm super excited to hear from our panelists in a little bit about more about bighorn. So our last group of animals are salamanders, and there's actually a few different species we cover here, and they're kind of our most unique, one of the most unique animals in California. We have a pretty high diversity of these critters for the Western US, and in general, amphibians are some of the most threatened class of vertebrates in the world. They are critically important to ecosystems because they serve as an overall indicator of habitat health. So if they're absent from an ecosystem they once lived in, something is probably pretty wrong. These animals have an awkward gait, but they shimmy their way over half a mile sometimes to get to their breeding ponds every year when our winter rains come. And salamanders can have some of the highest rates of collisions in certain parts of our states, with sometimes thousands being hit in one year. But these little critters can often go unnoticed. So in this story map, we highlight three species: California newts, California tiger salamanders, and the critically endangered Santa Cruz long-toed salamanders. Okay, so that's kind of the gist. And I wanted to quickly talk about kind of key takeaways, one of which was that Californians care for wildlife. After 100 hours of researching, visiting these sites, and meeting with community members, one of the most important things we learned was just people really care about wildlife across our state. We talked to community members in Baker, California, whose families once owned land in the Mojave National Preserve, who now believe in the balance of nature. In a bit, we'll hear from a community group started by a rancher in Petaluma and a hunter working to save bighorn sheep. So critically, this is one of our main points that we really hope comes across, is that wildlife conservation, at least for the people we talk to, is a priority for people, and people are spending a lot of time helping advance really big projects all across the state, which is really inspiring and exciting to see. And one other thing that is just a really common occurrence is that there's pretty significant gaps, even though we're already leading in so many ways. One of them is funding. And wildlife crossings should take years and they should take money. We want to make sure that we are spending our money wisely and actually conserving these animals. But many projects are having to wait a long time to fundraise enough money for them to be built. Of those 144 projects that our California Department of Transportation has identified as a priority, only 31 are fully funded. And this is not helped by a lack of coordination from state agencies on priority projects, where only roughly 55% of Caltrans's projects overlap with California Department of Fish and Wildlife priorities. And lastly, there's just overall gaps in data with little accuracy in reports on statewide roadkill. Often community groups are having to step up to make that difference. So we came up with a few recommendations for Environment California Research and Policy Center's work that we think could help California move a little faster on these projects. One of which is just that all state agencies, independent commissions, contracts, and auto insurance carriers should report data related to wildlife vehicle collisions. That could help fill some gaps, especially on county roads and other roads that aren't as frequently traveled on. State agencies should also create a single clear wildlife crossing prioritization plan. Kind of going on that coordination, it would really help coordinate resources if there was one plan for the entire state and not a few different ones. We'd also hope that we could create a wildlife corridor grant account where people could voluntarily and privately add to a fund for wildlife crossings to help fund things that they care about directly. And then one last thing we really want to emphasize is just that we get a lot of coverage of kind of these urban projects that are really important and covered throughout our story map. But we also found that the rich critical stories of wildlife crossing projects all over the state are just as important in these rural communities as well. And so we really want to advise the governor's office alongside elected officials to continue to work to promote rural connectivity projects that need extra support. So thank you so much. That's all I have, and I will turn it over to our panelists now. Each will dive into a wildlife crossing project they are working on to give a sense of what goes into one and the stories you'll find in our story map, Reconnecting California's Wildlife. So I'll start by introducing our speakers who will be overviewing their work to save the endangered peninsular desert bighorn sheep. So first, we have Dr. Christina Aiello. Christina is a wildlife biologist for Wildlands Network, an international nonprofit organization working to reconnect, restore, and rewild North America. She develops and conducts research on wildlife movement, connectivity, and road ecology throughout California's unique desert habitats. She studied bighorn sheep for over 7 years, and I'm so honored that she invited me to two wildlife crossing structures this year. So thank you so much for coming. And then I'll also introduce Devin O'D with Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. So Devin is the Western Policy and Conservation Manager for Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, where he works to promote and develop policy for federal, state, and local issues for conservation projects related to public lands, waters, and wildlife across the West, from Alaska to Montana and West Coast states. Thank you all for coming. Go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Sam. It's really great to be here and really appreciate your work to put all of this together. And thank you, Christina, for getting the slides up here. So, um, I have the privilege of getting to introduce the I-8 Wildlife Crossing Project to you all. And I'm going to give just kind of a little backstory on how we got here, and then I'm going to pass it over to the expert to really tell you a little bit more about peninsular sheep and kind of all of the details with our project. So I have gotten to work on desert bighorn sheep connectivity projects in Southern California for the better part of a decade now, in collaboration with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, with state and federal agencies, partner NGOs, and even the United States military. During a project several years ago where we were working with the Marine Corps helicopter crews to repair aging water catchment systems, also known as guzzlers, that were located deep in the backcountry, I had a conversation with the former peninsular bighorn sheep biologist with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And at that time, she implored us to do something about the sheep that were getting hit on Interstate 8. She quite frankly just told me that she was tired of scraping sheep off the road. And that was something that she had to do year after year during her research, doing necropsies. And a lot of these sheep they had collared and she had watched and tracked. And this is a location where the ewes for peninsular bighorn sheep go and have their lambs. And so this really stuck with me. And it was the catalyst that encouraged me to reach out to my colleague Mari Galloway with Wildlands Network, who I was working with on a project in Northern California, helping to restore connectivity for migratory mule deer herds. And together, we kind of put our heads together, and we knew that this particular region was one of CDFW's priority barriers for movement. And so we convened a group of stakeholders to kind of vet this idea and pitch it to the Wildlife Conservation Board for funding. Remarkably, because of the work that the Department of Fish and Wildlife had done to collar and to track the movement data for these sheep, we had a robust amount of information and understanding of the movement pathways for several different U groups that were in the area. That allowed us to get a full proposal and funding from the Wildlife Conservation Board in less than a year, which is very, very fast time frame. And so After that initial kind of convening, in April of 2023, we had representatives from the UC Davis Road Ecology Center, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Caltrans, the Wildlife Conservation Board, Campo Band of Mission Indians. We all got together on in the project area, in the proposed project area, and we did a site visit to look at potential and prospective crossing locations. And since then, we have conducted several more site visits. We've done multiple eco-flight aerial tours of the project area, and the full project team has been a part of many of those site visits as well, which includes Wildlands Network, Mark Thomas Engineering, and DUDEC to guide the project planning and crossing designs. Um, so, what is the goal here? Um, we're planning for a wildlife crossing. So the proposed project seeks to enhance permeability across Interstate 8, just east of the Imperial San Diego County line to alleviate one of California's most problematic barriers to wildlife movement in the state. And as traffic loads increase, peninsular bighorn sheep will eventually lose their ability to cross I-8 to reach critical sources for their survival. Um, why this location? Um, so I-8 bisects the Peninsular Mountain Range, impeding important seasonal and daily movement of federally endangered peninsular bighorn sheep and other wildlife species with its high rates of traffic. The project area includes a 5-mile stretch of critical habitat in between the east and westbound lanes of the interstate, where the Incopa group of sheep returns every year to have their lambs. They actually go in between these, it's essentially an island in between the freeway lanes where the sheep will go and have their lambs. And you can actually, driving this stretch of roadway, you can actually see sheep quite frequently very close to the roadway. Um, and so, because of the danger of having to cross this roadway, this is, ultimately impeding the seasonal movement pathways for this ewe group and other peninsular desert bighorn sheep. And so the development of a wildlife crossing project here and directional fencing along this busy interstate, this is going to be a critical step towards increasing permeability for bighorn sheep and other wildlife in the region and making the roadway safer for motorists. So with the big picture framing there, I'm very happy to pass this over to Christina to share a little bit more about the project.
Thank you so much, Devin. So I'm going to take where Devin left us and dive into a little more detail. And maybe you're wondering, why hasn't I-8 been targeted as a problem before? It's been around for decades. Well, one of the issues is that traffic has increased steadily over the years. And as traffic increases on our roads, we've come to expect different effects to the local wildlife. So at low traffic volumes, animals may be able to navigate the space between passing cars and cross safely. But as we get more cars traveling a road, the space between those vehicles gets smaller and it can be very unpredictable. So this ends up creating a deadly trap for wildlife that keep attempting to cross, but they're often hit and killed at high rates by vehicles. So this is our current situation at I-8. And if traffic volume continues to increase, then the space between cars pretty much becomes almost non-existent, and fewer animals even bother making the attempt to cross. Those that do almost always end up dead. So this is when we consider a road a complete barrier. And even though mortality rates aren't as high, it comes with its own set of problems. And perhaps you're wondering, why are bighorn taking the risk and crossing this road in the first place? Well, Devin already mentioned that unfortunately for this bighorn group that we call the Inkapa group, the interstate at this location splits and it surrounds a section of their habitat that they use to have and raise their lambs. Now, this section is further from good mountain lion habitat, so normally this would provide a safe place to raise their young and let them grow away from this primary predator. But though bighorn are hardwired to avoid predators due to hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, they are not hardwired to avoid roads. So if we don't act and we didn't start planning to build this wildlife crossing and fencing, we're first and foremost allowing this human safety risk to continue, which can and does lead to damaged vehicles and sometimes lost human lives. But also from the bighorn's perspective, the impacts are more than just mortality. It's about what else is lost when an individual that normally would survive dies due to a vehicle strike. That individual could have been a ram carrying unique genes from a distant population, possibly an individual that had been more robust to a disease and could hold the key to this population adapting to an introduced pathogen. It could have been an elder ewe, which had gathered information about the resources across the landscape over her 18 years of life, steadily passing that knowledge to her young and her kin that travel with her and learn year to year as new challenges arise. These are the subtle impacts that we can't easily measure, but they add up to slow our attempts to recover species. And when our roads and other infrastructure, like a completed border wall, creates a complete barrier to wildlife movement, the lack of direct mortality does not mean that those effects aren't equally dangerous. They're just slower and difficult to show to the public. These are things like fewer mating opportunities, which can lead to inbreeding, low genetic diversity, and future health problems. It can lead to access to fewer resources that may have been critical to get the group through a really bad drought year. It can cause higher risk to one bad disease outbreak that can wipe out most of a small fragmented population, but that a larger, more connected one may have weathered better. Added up, these impacts create a large burden to the conservation and management of these species and require more time, more money, more hands-on activities to maintain and grow the population. But the group that I work with sought a new future, a different future, where we do act. And when we act, we not only take steps to preserve this one group of bighorn, we're also taking a step to preserve our natural and cultural history. What I find unique and inspiring about desert bighorn in California is that these are the populations that have survived in the West when many other bighorn populations in less arid regions were wiped out by diseases and other human impacts. Many of these populations in California didn't need to be reestablished by translocations from distant areas, which occurred in many other Western states. So, we are the stewards of the largest collection of native bighorn populations in the US. Populations that have played an important role in the indigenous history and cultures of these areas, populations that retain their adaptations and behaviors learned and passed on for generations. So much so that we can actually see this on a molecular level. We can see that the genes in desert bighorn sheep are slightly different depending on what part of the landscape and which habitat that you find them in. So preserving quality connected habitats allows wildlife to dictate their own future, and it minimizes how much we need to intervene in an attempt to replicate what nature should already be doing on its own. And I really want you all to think about this, and I really want to thank Environment California's Research and Policy Centers for highlighting this approach and the importance of habitat connectivity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina and Devin. I really appreciated hearing more about the peninsular desert bighorn sheep. So next I'll introduce our last speaker, who was originally Sally Gale, but could no longer make it. So Christine Davidian will present on her behalf. Christine is a Chileno Valley Newt Brigade captain that has worked with the Chileno or volunteered with the Chileno Valley Newt Brigade for 5 years. They are a community nonprofit working to save California newts on a small road outside of Petaluma. They share a remarkable story, one that continues to inspire my work. I was fortunate enough to visit the brigade on a misty Tuesday in January. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you for inviting us to speak. I will get right into it by sharing my, 1 second, please share, 1 second. Sorry, I'm having trouble finding the share. 1 second, here we go, share. Okay, can everybody see? Okay,
Yes,
thank
we
you.
can see.
So as you can see, we're at the Chileno Valley Newt Brigade, and it is actually the road that we help to save the newts is Chileno Valley along a lake called Laguna Lake. And it was founded in 2019 when a mile stretch of land along Laguna Lake, which is a natural lake in Sonoma County, was discovered by Sally Gale, who one day was driving by and just saw orange mush all over the road. And she discovered that there were dozens and dozens of these California newts that were smashed all over the road. It is the migration route of these newts and also frogs and other amphibians that go up from the hillside across the road down to the lake, which has been happening for millennia, I'm sure. And it is the migration path for breeding. And after they're done breeding in the lake, they cross the road once again to go back up into the hill. So I have multiple times where they could get possibly hit by vehicles. We have the voluntary group of citizens dedicated to preserving this species, and we have over 100 people per season that come and volunteer. And we currently have over 900 people who are following the activities of the New Brigade. What we do on the road, we start from October to March when the rain starts. We go out every night at dusk with a team of a different team for every night that has different people and volunteers, at 10 to 12 volunteers per night, and a captains per night that go out with the teams. And we work in pairs to cover the mile road where we go and we collect data for each newt that you can see. Is actually, there's a newt right here, and the data is being collected. And we train our people for safety because we're on the actual physical road, the public road. It's public land on both sides, so we have to maintain ourselves in that road. And we train everybody how to handle and document the newts, and everything is documented with iNaturalist, which is a project that we actually create for every season that we document, and we document all live and dead animals on the road. This is what it sort of looks like. This is a 2025-2026 New Brigade project that we created. You can actually see we've had 698 observations, almost 5,000 observations. Within each of those observations, it could be up to one or multiple newts or frogs, over 31 species. And you can see there were 117 people in this year's project. And this is over here to the right, just an example of what an observation looks like. You'll see a newt and information that we put in there for each of our species that we archive. And then here is actually a statistic that shows from 2019 to 2025-2026 season, what our numbers look like. As you can see, we started where we were at sort of 53% survival rate, jumped up to 77, and we're hovering around 82 to 84%. As you can see, we had a very huge year, 2023-24, where the numbers rose significantly because of a huge population of juvenile newts that survived that year. But as you can see, we had a huge death rate that year, and a majority of these were dead juveniles that were crossing out of the lake, going back into the hill to become adults. Next slide is a group of us that went to the Transportation Authority of Marin County on March 4th to ask for $1 million to help us with our wildlife crossing engineering. As you can see, we were a huge group that showed up, and with spirit of wearing these costumes to show them how active we are and how serious we are in getting help for our newts. And that is the end of what I have. I have other slides if anybody has questions.
Thank you so much. Your work is really amazing. It's so amazing that so many people got out to that transportation meeting. Well, that's all our presentations. And now we would go to questions. Feel free to put any Q&A in the chat. Great. So the first question is from Dale. Are there any Mexican government slash NGO partnerships on the Bighorn project? And has the border wall construction modified Bighorn movement? I'll pass that question on to Christina and Devin.
Yes, thank you, Dale, for that question. We have been coordinating with a number of NGOs on the Mexico side, as well as university researchers. From Sanctuario Cimarron is one NGO that is really working towards peninsular bighorn conservation on the Mexico side. And they're very interested in preserving bighorn connectivity between the US and Mexico, as well as Terra Peninsular is another organization, and Fauna del Noroeste. Sorry, my Spanish isn't very good, but yes, we've been reaching out to a number of these NGOs and including them on this project and trying to incorporate wildlife mitigations in the border wall to ensure that there is continued connectivity between the countries, because that is just as important as connectivity across our roadways as well.
Great. Thank you so much. The next question I'll answer, which is from Tim, who asks, wildlife crossings have been proven successful in many other states. So what's the ask here? Are you looking for funding? So I'll go ahead and answer that. So this report and work is really to help demonstrate just the sheer amount of projects that are going on in California. And most of these projects are unfunded. And so one of the main asks in general is that we need to create new funding mechanisms so we can fund all California projects. And I think there's a few other things, which is just to show that this is something that Californians really care about. We envision a world where in California and across North America, to be honest, our wildlife can cross over and under our roads without us even noticing. And so we have to get the data, the coordination, and funding to make sure that can happen. Yeah, and I'll open it up to anyone else who wants to jump in on that one.
Yeah, Sam, I'll jump in there too. I think, are we looking for funding? Yes. And that's like I think an all play. And when you look at, what other states have done with wildlife crossings, I think California has really embraced this work recently, but comparatively, we are behind significantly in our infrastructure in a lot of locations. And so we really need to kind of catch up to what many other states have done, particularly with like big game species, to kind of reduce some of those barriers to movement. So I think, the question is, are we looking for funding? Yes, at a state level, but also at a federal level. There's wildlife crossings pilot program that needs to be reauthorized. And so there's definitely a federal legislative push, but also it's kind of like an all, sourcing this from wherever you can get. And just speaking directly to our project, we're in the planning and design phase. So our grant covers, that initial planning and permitting to be able to get to that point where you're nearly shovel ready, but then you still need that money to actually build the project. And so, there's a lot that goes into these. It's a lot more expensive, particularly because you want to make sure that investment is done in the right place. And so in order to have a sound investment, you need really good data on movement and to be sure like where you're going to put these locations, they're going to be utilized by the wildlife. And so that just, speaks to funding the department and the work of the biologists and camera studies and wildlife callers to be able to really understand how the wildlife are moving.
Great. Thank you so much. Um, I'll go ahead to the next question, which is for Christine, which is, what is the status on creating a safe corridor for the newts?
Right. So the last 2 years has been in feasibility study. We actually received money from California Fish and Wildlife to proceed with that. And we actually have final designs are almost done. I believe the report's going to come out any time now, but we've actually seen all the different recommendations for the crossing. So we're very close, but it takes, as you know, as Sam mentioned, it takes many steps to get through to get the process going, and obviously lots of funding is required. And So I actually have a picture of something. If do you think, Sam, that I should show that picture? Because it goes into the next question that says, can tubes be added underneath the road?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just quickly share and I can show you what it kind of looks like. Share, and let's go back to this. And can everybody see?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is actually the lake itself. And then this is what the road looks like, or what it's going to look like. So there are going to be these little tunnels, and you can actually see the height is, this is a newt right here, and as you can see, this is a red-legged frog, which brings up the issue that we have discovered hundreds of red-legged frogs now since we've been doing this. Their population has actually been increasing since we've been working with the newts. And so this is what that'll kind of, so that to raise the height so that, the frogs can get through because they can jump higher than newts. And then if you look at this next picture here, it'll actually show you, I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of, I can't see something here, 1 second. Get rid of, there we go. This is actually the stretch of the mile. And on this end here, you can see that looks like where most of the newts are right now. Every single dot that you see represents a tunnel. This was done before we gave the data to Fish and Wildlife. On this other end are where most of the red-legged frogs are. So we believe that these, west end and east end are where the if we at least have some partial build, that it would have to be on both of these ends, but we certainly like to have it all the way across. But each one of these dots is a tunnel. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Um, I'm gonna go ahead and go to Sam's question, which is, are the sizes of wildlife corridors restricted more by one thing than another, i.e. funding, size of species, and allowance of physical space? And I think I'll throw that one over to Christina. There's a little bit of room.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question, and kind of how you design the crossing structure is going to depend a lot on the species you want to target and their behaviors. And also just some of the terrain characteristics and what's actually feasible to construct on the landscape. So there are some wildlife behaviorally that prefer large open spaces and would use an overpass more so than an underpass. And things like the width of the structure may also come into play to increase the space that wildlife have between them and some of the disturbances of the roadway. So if you have a very high trafficked area where there's just going to be a lot of noise, a lot of vehicles traveling, you're going to want kind of a wider structure so that the animals don't have to be at the very edge while they're using that crossing. And then that gives them a little safe, they still feel a little wary when they're crossing, but it gives them a little buffer between them and the noise and all the visual disturbance. And so some of these structures that look like underground tunnels and things, those are going to be dictated by those species, whether they feel comfortable in a dark space, whether they're going to need some lighting coming in from the top. So all these things really require a lot of biologists to be on staff. It requires a lot of existing data sets about the structures that are already on the landscape and what wildlife are using them. And we're kind of using all this information to tweak these designs. And that's going to determine where the structures go, how large they are, whether you need certain features like lighting coming in through the top or not. And so we're learning as we go, and we have a lot of science to kind of guide us at this point. But that's why a lot of these crossing projects really need data collection while we're continuing, so we can keep improving these designs and make them the best that they can be for wildlife. And there are always financial costs, and I think if we were to build these structures to be the best for wildlife, we would have things like sound barriers, visual barriers, we'd have elevated roadways, things that add up in costs to make the perfect structure design for wildlife. So that's something you have to balance. What can you actually get funded and built on the landscape versus what do you need for the wildlife to actually get through safely to maintain some of that ecological connectivity. So it's all a balance because we recognize we have limited funding available for these projects And we want as many of them as we can on the landscape.
Yeah, that was a great answer. Thank you so much. A question from Vicky is, and I'm asking this because it's actually one of the sites that we cover in this story map. So how is the Caltrans and US Fish and Wildlife Service project for 3 crossings over I-15 for bighorn sheep coming along? Have they started on it? All right, I'll pass that over to Christina, actually.
Yes, so that is further along. We're past kind of that initial planning and design phase. And right now, the actual construction is out to bid for different companies to plan some of the initial design work and construction work and costs. And then from there, a single team will be selected to actually move forward with construction. The timeline of when that construction starts has kind of varied a lot. I've been heard things by the end of this year. I think that's all going to depend. So right now, there is bidding going on for the next phase, which will actually be construction.
Great. Um, Great. I think we have time for one more question, so I'll give everyone a second. If everyone wants to put a question in, we'll pick one more. Give everyone a moment for that. Um, but if not, I think kind of following on this I-15 area, I'll ask Sam's question, what kind of merits do you place on the push for public transportation in lieu of public highways? Obviously, that won't circumvent the need for wildlife crossings as we have so heavily invested in road structures, but it seems as if public transport is ultimately a mitigator of wildlife collisions. I think I'll pass that over to Christina, but anyone can jump in on this one.
Yeah, folks, feel free to add on, but I would say that that's absolutely true. And I think one of the ways in which we can deal with these wildlife collisions and these problems of roadways is to reflect on how we ourselves travel in a number of ways. I think public transportation and reducing how many vehicle miles we're traveling is one part of that. I also think just being more aware as we are traveling in our vehicles on roadways, especially when they're traversing through protected areas like national parks or public lands. These are areas where we see high amounts of wildlife vehicle collisions. And so it can be your own personal responsibility to be aware, to look at those roadway signs that show elk, bighorn. Those are placed at high mortality spots. They're not a joke. I know we get a little complacent seeing them, and when we don't see the wildlife after traveling those roads many, many times, we kind of get numb to them. But they are actually placed in these particular locations, and more of them are going on our roads. So I think we should be reflecting inward as well as what we do as a society and how we travel.
Yeah. Devin, you have a few thoughts to wrap us up?
Sam, if I could just follow on to that, speed
Mhm.
is also an issue. So, yes, highways, speed is faster, but like on our country road, people do not adhere to some of those speeds. And so we actually have to put out safety signs, so that people slow down. If people could slow down, it would be a lot easier that they could actually maybe even see them crossing and stop. But going really fast, you don't see small animals crossing.
Mhm.
That is a great point, Christine. I wanted to add and provide a little context to that question too about just how we're developing infrastructure and how we're repairing infrastructure, and point to some really great work that Wildlands Network has done to lead. It's on a kind of the policy side of coordination and encouraging Caltrans and our various agencies to implement wildlife connectivity work and modeling and crossing into roadway improvement projects. And, when we're talking about things like public infrastructure, Sam, specifically like the Brightline West project, like if we're putting in a big public transit system, we need to make sure that it's part of the policy and the culture of our state to be integrating wildlife connectivity and corridors, because it's a lot easier to do that during the construction phase. And this even includes like when we're expanding freeways or you're repairing an off ramp. Like there's a lot of great work that's been done to advance that, so that we're not necessarily starting from scratch, but we're just building this into like how we deal with infrastructure improvement projects across the state. So some great work to be done there, and a lot more that I think we can expand on.
Yeah, thanks for that extra context. So that's all the time we have. Thank you all so much for coming. I just have one sentence to kind of close us off. So for wildlife crossings, they're helping solve the relative cost of our collisions and the animals' lives lost. And our map, Reconnecting California's Wildlife, shows off the work we have been doing to gather the real stories of our wildlife and Californians. It showed us that people care and will work diligently to see these animals reconnected. And thank you again so much for coming. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.